David sat deeply sunk into an old armchair with worn upholstery. The room was small, lit by a single wall lamp whose faint yellow light cast inexpressive shadows on the faded wallpaper. The air in the room was saturated with the smell of furniture polish and the slight bitterness of time. On the low table in front of him lay a few magazines, their bent corner pages long since lost their former brightness. Most of them were women's magazines with glossy covers announcing health tips, recipes and beauty secrets in large letters. David never once reached out for these magazines, unwilling to even touch something so foreign to his condition. It seemed to him that even this innocuous action could give away his insecurity. Instead, he focused on the barely audible melody coming from a speaker somewhere overhead. The classical music seemed too harmonious for the room where he sat waiting for something that would probably ruin his life for good. His gaze wandered around the room, glancing at the small details. The subtle cracks in the ceiling, the polished edge of the table, the roughly hemmed edge of the curtain on the window. All these little things distracted him from the main thing, the heaviness in his chest, which was getting heavier by the minute. It seemed to him that there was a muffled whisper behind the thin walls of the room, but perhaps it was only a play of his imagination. Suddenly the door opened and Susan entered the room. David immediately tensed. Her steps were light, but everything in her gait betrayed uncertainty. She paused for a moment as if wondering if she should go any further, and then closed the door behind her, careful not to make a loud noise. Susan looked up and met his gaze. There was something unfamiliar in her face, a mixture of shyness and a faint smile that was more like a fleeting movement of the lips than a genuine expression of joy or friendliness. She lingered at the door, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of a small clutch. "Hi," she said in a near whisper, not moving from her seat. David was silent. His eyes darted to the side as if he were avoiding her gaze. He knew that if he looked her straight in the face, he wouldn't be able to contain the avalanche of thoughts and feelings that were now raging inside. Instead, he stared at the window beyond which he could see only darkness. Susan took a few steps forward. Her heels tapped deafeningly on the faded carpet. She stopped near the desk, her gaze sliding over the scattered magazines. For a moment she leaned over as if she were going to pick one up, but changed her mind. "Thank you for coming," she finally said, her voice as quiet as her footsteps. She looked up at him, but without waiting for a response, she sank into the chair next to him. They were sitting quite close now. The space between their chairs seemed greater than the actual distance. It was filled with all that had been left unspoken between them over the past weeks. David was silent. His face was still, but the fingers on the arm of the chair twitched slightly, giving away the tension. He didn't want to be here, but he'd come. What? It was a question he'd asked himself more than once, and never once had he found an answer that could satisfy. Susan sighed. She turned her head in his direction, her eyes studying his profile. "I know how it looks," she said after a long pause. "But I really want to make it right." David turned his head sharply and their gazes met. There was an icy coldness in his eyes that made her recoil, though she didn't physically move away. He said nothing. That silence was more eloquent than any words. Susan lowered her head, her hands clutching her clutch. She took a deep breath, about to continue, but she was interrupted by sounds on the other side of the wall. Someone was sobbing, perhaps crying. Susan looked up, and for a moment something akin to fear flashed in her gaze. The door to the next room creaked open and a woman with reddened eyes stepped out. She crossed the room quickly without even glancing at those sitting inside, and disappeared behind another door. The room fell back into tense silence. Susan exhaled slowly and turned to David again. Her voice trembled. "I hope Dr. Marks can help us," she said, trying to sound confident. "We'll be able to move on, won't we?" David only shrugged his shoulders slightly. He didn't want to say a word, didn't want to show how badly he was hurt. He felt like if he started talking he wouldn't be able to stop, and all the chaos he was holding inside would erupt, destroying everything around him. The door to the office opened softly, and out stepped a woman of medium height, with close-cropped hair and a look as if she could defuse any tense situation with a flick of her hand. Dr. Fran Marks. Her name was printed in crisp lettering on a sign by the door that swayed slightly with every step she took. She wore a simple brown sweater, slightly stretched at the shoulders, and a green skirt that fell to the middle of her calves. Her gait was confident, but not without a softness, as if every movement had been carefully calculated. "Mr. and Mrs. Stillwell?" she asked, giving them both a look that did not linger, but recorded every detail. Susan nodded at once, rising from her seat. Her hands adjusted her dress, as if she were trying to give herself more confidence. David remained seated, his gaze drifting away, clearly avoiding direct contact with the doctor. "Welcome," Dr. Marks continued without waiting for their responses. "Please follow me." Her voice was flat, almost emotionless, but still with a touch of professional involvement. She turned and headed back into the office. Susan stepped forward but didn't hear David's footsteps behind her and stopped. "David," she called softly, turning around. He didn't look up at once, but after a few seconds he reluctantly rose from his chair. His movements were slow, almost reluctant. Once on his feet, he waved his hand as if to say, "Go on, I'll follow you." Susan threw him a quick look of contradiction, a mixture of gratitude and fear, and followed the doctor. Dr. Marks' office was much more spacious than the narrow hallway would suggest. The walls, painted a soft pastel color, didn't press but didn't offer warmth either. A tall wooden desk stood by the window, and on it were neat stacks of papers and a notebook with a pen, ready for note-taking. In the corner of the office was a small table with a coffee pot and a couple of mugs. The air was filled with a light scent of vanilla, not strong enough to irritate, but noticeable enough to make it feel cozy. "Have a seat," Dr. Marks said, pointing to 2 chairs in front of her desk. Susan immediately took a seat, putting one leg over the other and folding her hands in her lap. She seemed slightly tense but tried to keep her face straight. David sat down slowly as if testing the chair for strength. He didn't cross his legs or try to strike a comfortable pose. His back was straight, his arms resting on the armrests. Dr. Marks sat down across from them. She interlocked her fingers, resting her elbows on the table, and looked at both of them intently, as if she were trying to read their minds. The silence lasted a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. "So," she finally said, her voice calm but respectful, "I understand that your judge insisted on this counseling at the request of Susan's attorney, correct?" Susan nodded hastily. "Yes," she replied. "We're here to try to make things right." Her voice sounded weak, as if she doubted her words would make any difference. David remained silent, his gaze directed somewhere over Dr. Marks' shoulder. "David," the doctor turned to him, her tone a little softer, "what about you? Why did you agree to come here?" He turned his head slowly in her direction, and there was nothing but weariness in his eyes. "The judge said I should come here," he answered briefly, then turned away again. Dr. Marks nodded as if that were enough. She made a few notes in her notebook, then set it aside. "All right," she said. "Let's start simple. Each of you has a different perspective on what's going on. But here in this office, it's important to be honest. Not just with yourselves but with each other. It's the only way to move forward." She looked at Susan. "Susan, tell me why you thought this divorce could be stopped." Susan clenched her hands in her lap, her gaze falling to her shoes. She held her breath, then spoke as if she was afraid of being interrupted. "Because I still love him," she said, her voice shaking. "I made a mistake, but it doesn't mean anything. I want him to come home to everyone. Our children want that. Our parents, everyone wants that." David grinned but didn't say a word. His gaze continued to be cold, and he looked directly at Dr. Marks, ignoring Susan. "David," the doctor turned to him, "you heard what your wife said. What do you think of it?" He raised his head slightly, as if only now he realized he was being addressed. "I don't think words mean anything," he said at last. "Deeds are more important than words." Susan turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "But she began but stopped when Dr. Marks raised her hand, urging her not to interrupt. "We'll deal with that a little later," the doctor said. "David, you believe Susan did what she did to break the trust between you. Is that correct?" He nodded. "Not only destroyed," he added quietly, "but buried that trust." Susan flinched at those words. She looked away, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her dress. Dr. Marks watched their every movement carefully, not missing any hint of what was behind the words. "All right," she said at last. "This is just the beginning. We have a lot to talk about before we can come to any kind of understanding." The room was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint squeak of Dr. Marks' pen as she made notes in her notebook. David sat motionless, his eyes staring out the window, as if he were trying to find answers to the questions that plagued his soul. Susan, on the other hand, looked confused. Her fingers were fiddling with the edge of the clutch on her lap. She didn't know where to begin, but she realized that the moment for candor had arrived. "Susan," Dr. Marks said softly, but with the firmness of someone used to dealing with difficult situations. "I want you to tell me everything from the beginning. What happened between you two? What was the starting point of this conflict?" Susan took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts into a coherent whole. She felt her throat tighten with tension, but she knew that silence would make it worse. "It was 5 weeks ago," she began, her voice shaking. I told David that I was going to meet a man. It was some stupid idea, an impulse that now seems terrible to me." Her words came out quietly, almost uncertainly. She avoided looking at her husband, knowing that his look of cold judgment could break her completely. David, hearing her confession, turned sharply toward her. His face remained impenetrable, but the tense line of his jaw and slightly trembling hands betrayed an inner anger. "Going to meet?" he echoed. His voice was quiet, but you could hear the threat in it. "Is that what you call it?" Susan tried to squeeze out a weak smile, but quickly realized it only made things worse. She lowered her eyes to avoid his stare. "I didn't go on that date," she added hastily. "I canceled it." "You don't understand," David interrupted her, his voice louder but still cold. "This isn't about whether you went or not. It's about whether you thought about it at all." Dr. Marks raised her eyebrows, watching this exchange. She made another notation in her notebook, then gently leaned forward. "Susan," she addressed, trying to tone down the heat. "Can you tell me more about what prompted you to take this step? Why did you decide to tell your husband?" Susan crossed her legs nervously and clasped her hands together, her breathing shallow. Her eyes darted around the room as if looking for a way out, but finally settled on Dr. Marks. "It was a moment of weakness," she said in a broken voice. "I felt alone. David was always busy at work, he came home late, we barely spoke. And then there was someone who paid attention to me. It was stupid, I know. But I wanted to be honest. That's why I decided to tell him." "Honest?" David repeated ironically. His voice was filled with bitterness. "You call it honesty when you tell your husband that you intend to spend the night with another man?" Susan blushed, her lips trembled, but she tried not to cry. "I didn't intend to spend the night with him," she protested. "It was just a date." David grinned, leaning back in his chair. His eyes flashed with cold fire. "Just a date," he repeated. "Tell me, Susan, what exactly were you planning to do after dinner with him?" "Nothing," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "I wouldn't have gone any further. I just wanted to figure out what I was going to do next in my life." These words made David rise from his chair. His movements were abrupt, and he took a step toward the window, turning his back to his wife. He stood there for a few seconds with his fists clenched, then took a deep breath. "You know," he began without turning around, "it doesn't matter to me. The only thing that matters to me is intent. You were going to do this, you've already made that decision. Everything else is just excuses." Dr. Marks gently raised her hand, calling for silence. "David," she said softly but firmly, "let me be clear. Do you believe that even intent can destroy a relationship?" He turned around, and his eyes reflected such pain that even Dr. Marks tensed slightly. "Yes," he answered briefly, "because intention is a choice." And she had made her choice. Susan sobbed. She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. She felt everything crumbling, how every word she said only made things worse. But something inside her still made her look up. "I canceled this date," she whispered, as if trying to justify herself. "I realized it was a mistake. I wanted to make it right." David only shook his head. "You only realized it after I refused to put up with it," he said. "And that doesn't make up for what you did." Dr. Marks watched them both carefully, trying to gauge how deep their problem went. She set aside her pen and folded her hands in front of her. "Susan," she spoke, "you want your husband to believe you and give your marriage a second chance. But in order for that to happen, you need to understand why his trust was lost." Susan looked at her but didn't answer. Her gaze was blank, as if she was searching for meaning in the doctor's every word. David sat back in his chair, his movements slow, as if he were carrying a huge weight. "It's no use," he said, looking directly at the doctor. "She can say whatever she wants. But in my eyes, she's already ruined everything." Dr. Marks made another note, then looked up. "This is just the beginning of our conversation," she said calmly. "And I think we need to go deeper into how you both feel. But first, Susan, I want to hear everything. No excuses. Just the facts." Susan squirmed, as if her words were the last drops that might finally drown their marriage. Dr. Marks, sitting at her desk, cautiously raised her head. Her notebook lay before her, pen raised, ready to record every detail of this tense conversation. She looked first at David, then at Susan, assessing their condition. "Let's try to work this out," she finally said. Her voice was calm but firm. "Susan, you say you still love your husband. Can you tell me what you mean by that feeling?" Susan raised her head, her eyes glistening with the tears she was struggling to hold back. "I love David," she began in a shaky voice. I've always loved him. Everything that happened. It was stupid, a mistake I never wanted to make. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving him. David snorted, his lips curving in a bitter grin. Love him? He interjected, not hiding his sarcasm. If that's your love, I shudder to imagine what hate looks like. Susan flinched at his words but tried to remain calm. She turned to him, her gaze full of pleading. David, she said, her voice sounding quieter, I haven't done anything that you can't forgive. I didn't go on a date, I didn't cheat on you. I realized everything and called it off right away. Doesn't that mean nothing? David straightened abruptly, his eyes flashing with cold anger. Does it? He said slowly, emphasizing each word. You want me to forget everything just because you changed your mind? Because you're afraid of the consequences? That doesn't change your choice, Susan. You've already made your decision. You've already ruined our relationship. His voice sounded as hard as a hammer. Susan lowered her head, her hands trembling and her lips tight with tension. Dr. Marks made a few notes, then put the notebook aside and leaned forward slightly. David, she said to him, I understand how you feel. But let's try to look at the situation differently. Susan claims to love you. You don't believe what she says at all? He looked at the doctor with a hard stare, as if considering whether to answer at all. No, he said briefly, then added, words don't mean anything. If she really loved me, she wouldn't even think about going on this date. Susan raised her head sharply, her eyes filled with despair. This isn't fair, she exclaimed. You're judging me for something I didn't even do. You leave me no chance to prove my love to you. David looked at her coldly. You've already proved it, he said, his voice quiet but there was steel in it. Proved it by choosing another man even at the level of thought. Love is an action, not an excuse. Susan sighed, her shoulders slumping as if an invisible weight was pressing down on her. She turned to Dr. Marks, her voice trembling. What can I do? She asked, her words sounding almost like a whisper. How can I make this right? Dr. Marks looked at her thoughtfully, then shifted her gaze to David. Fixing it is a process, she said carefully. But first we need to understand if you're both ready for it. David, are you ready to work on rebuilding trust? Or have you already made your final decision? David hesitated, his gaze fading. He didn't answer immediately, his fingers clenched on the armrests of his chair. He started but stopped as if he couldn't find the words. Then he sighed heavily and turned back to the window. I don't know how you can trust a man who turns his back on you so easily. Susan dropped her face into her palms, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Dr. Marks leaned forward, her voice soft but still insistent. Susan, she addressed her, if you had the ability to turn back time, what would you do differently? Susan raised her head, her face red with tears. I would never allow myself to even think about it, she said sincerely. I would have focused on David, on us, on our family, on our love. David looked at her with an expression that was hard to decipher. It was a mixture of anger, frustration, and perhaps a faint shadow of doubt. It's too late, he said finally. His voice sounded tired, as if he didn't believe his own words but couldn't admit it. Dr. Marks folded her hands on the table and took a deep breath. We still have time to talk, she said. But it's important that you both hear each other. It's the only way to move forward, whatever your choice. The words hung in the air, leaving room for reflection and new revelations. Dr. Marks sat at her desk, her gaze fixed on David and Susan as if she were trying to penetrate their thoughts. For a moment there was a tense silence in the room, which only added to the sense that this was not just a family counseling session, but a kind of trial where words could be decisive evidence. Intent, Dr. Marks finally spoke, her voice flat but with an undercurrent of energy. It's an interesting question. Many people think that intentions don't matter until they are translated into action. But it's not that simple. She folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, creating a sense of trust. Susan looked up at her, her gaze full of despair. David, on the other hand, looked as if he was awaiting a verdict he had known for a long time. Susan, the doctor turned to her, you say you've done nothing. It's true. You canceled your date and it was the right thing to do. But let me ask you a question. Why did you agree to this meeting in the first place? Susan swallowed, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her skirt. She opened her mouth to answer, but closed it immediately, as if afraid that any word might be used against her. She began quietly. I was confused. I didn't know how to deal with my feelings. Dr. Marks nodded, her face remaining calm. That's understandable, she said. But be honest. Did you realize that your acceptance of the date might be seen by David as a betrayal? Susan looked away, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't think about it then, she whispered. I just wanted to feel like someone wanted me. David snorted, a bitter grin contorting his face. Someone needs you, he repeated, his voice full of sarcasm. What about being needed by me? Or our children? Susan sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Dr. Marks raised her hand, calling for silence. David, she said, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that intent is already a breach of trust? He looked at her, his eyes cold but tired. Yes, he answered. If a person was willing to do something that would destroy our marriage, that's bad enough. Her decision to cancel the date doesn't change anything. It's like trying to rob a bank. If you planned it but changed your mind at the last minute, you're still guilty of intent. Dr. Marks raised her eyebrows, her face impenetrable. That's an interesting analogy, she said. But let's get this straight. You believe that Susan's intention is tantamount to a crime. However, if she refused to take that action, isn't that evidence that she realized her mistake? David pressed his lips together, his fingers gripping the armrests of the chair. Realized? He asked again. She only realized because I wouldn't let her. Her apology isn't remorse, it's fear of the consequences. Dr. Marks nodded, making a few notes in her notebook. Then she turned to Susan again. Susan, she said softly, do you understand why your husband feels this way about your actions? Susan nodded, her voice barely audible. I understand, she whispered. But I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't know how to express my feelings. Dr. Marks paused, her gaze fixed on the notebook, but she seemed to be thinking about something important. Let me use your analogy, David, she finally said, her voice a little louder. If someone planned a bank robbery, that's certainly a crime. But if that person realized their mistake before they made the first move, shouldn't that be taken into account? David frowned, his gaze hardening. It doesn't change the fact that they were willing to do it, he argued. Intent already breaks trust. How can I trust a man who was willing to betray me again? Dr. Marks leaned back slightly, her hands remaining folded in front of her. Trust is a fragile thing, she said. And rebuilding it takes time and effort. But to move forward, it's important to understand one thing. Do you want to rebuild that trust? Or have you already decided it's impossible? The words hung in the air like a knife ready to cut their bond completely. Susan looked at David, her eyes full of pleading. I'm willing to do anything to regain your trust, she said, her voice trembling. But you have to give me a chance. David looked at her, his face remaining cold. A chance? He repeated. Susan, you've already taken your chance and you've lost it. Dr. Marks rose from her seat, her movements slow but sure. We need to continue this conversation, she said. But I want you both to think about one thing. What's more important to you, to keep your relationship or to stand up for your principles? She was silent, her gaze back on David and Susan. Once again the room fell into a tense silence, filled with unspoken words and repressed feelings. The room fell into a visceral silence, broken only by the muffled sound of classical music coming from the far corner of the room. Dr. Marks folded her hands on the table and watched David and Susan carefully, her gaze sliding between them like a judge ready to pass judgment. Susan sat in her chair, her eyes red with tears, but she continued to fight for the remnants of hope. Her hands gripped the clutch so tightly that her fingers turned white. David, on the other hand, looked like a man who had already made his decision. His posture was tense but unmoving and his face remained stony. David, Dr. Marks began softly, I understand this is difficult for you. But before you say anything, I want to make sure you really understand what your decision will lead to. This is not just the end of your marriage. It's a consequence that will affect both of you, your family, your children. David looked at her, his gaze cold and focused. I've thought about it, he said slowly, each word sounding like a hammer blow. And I know it's the right decision. Susan shuddered, her shoulders slumping as if David's words had stabbed into her. She tried to say something, but her voice trailed off and only a faint sob escaped her throat. She dropped her gaze to her hands, which trembled with tension. David, her voice finally broke through, weak but full of desperation. I know I made a mistake. But doesn't love mean forgiveness? Can't you give me one more chance to prove that I can make it right? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain he wouldn't allow himself to express. Love means respect, Susan, he said flatly. And you've destroyed it. You can make excuses all you want, but I can't trust you anymore. She sobbed louder, her hands rising to her face to hide her tears. Her body shook like a brittle branch in a strong wind. Dr. Marks rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached Susan, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Susan," she said gently, "I can see how much you want to save this marriage. But it's important to realize now that your husband's decision is his choice, one that you can no longer influence." Susan raised her head, her face contorted with despair. "But I can't just let him go," she whispered. "I can't imagine my life without him." Dr. Marks bent slightly to meet her gaze. "It hurts," she said. "But sometimes in order to move forward you have to accept that you can't get the past back." She returned to her seat, her gaze now focused on David. "David," she turned to him, "is this your final decision?" He nodded, his face impassive. "Yes," he answered firmly. "I can't live with a person who doesn't respect me the way I respected her." Susan burst into tears again, her hands covering her face. David didn't move from his seat, his gaze fixed forward, as if he was afraid that even one glance in her direction might shatter his resolve. Dr. Marks nodded, accepting his words, and made a few notes in her notebook. Then she stood up, her movements again slow and respectful. "This concludes our joint consultation," she said, her voice soft but confident. "David, I will notify the court that you have reached your final decision." She turned to Susan. "Susan, I suggest that we continue our work. You will need to learn to deal with these feelings and move on." Susan only nodded, her gaze remained downcast. David rose from his chair, his movements were slow but sure. He lingered for a moment, looking at Susan, but then turned away and headed for the door. As the door closed behind him, Susan pressed her hands to her face with force, her sobs filling the room. Dr. Marks walked over to her again, stooped down to the level of her gaze and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think you are," she said softly. "And you'll get through this." But those words meant nothing to Susan yet. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.